A plane was descending toward a small airfield in the middle of Africa, carrying the most important diplomat in the world. He was the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he was flying through the night to negotiate a ceasefire in a war that had the potential to reshape the continent. The airfield was Nondola, in what was then northern Rhodesia. The plane was a Douglas DC-6 chartered from a Swedish company with a Swedish crew. 16 people were on board. The plane never landed. It was found the next morning in the forest, a few kilometers short of the runway, burned and broken. Everyone on board was dead 15 instantly, and one survivor, a UN security officer named Harold Julian, who lived for 6 days before succumbing to his injuries. In those 6 days before the sedation took him fully, Julian spoke of sparks of an explosion of something happening to the plane before it came down. The authorities dismissed his account. He was too injured, they said, too medicated, too confused. That dismissal is the first locked door in this case. It will not be the last. The man on the plane was Dag Hammarskjöld, and to understand why his death still matters, why the United Nations itself is still, as of the most recent report in 2024, actively investigating a crash that happened over 60 years ago, you need to understand what he was doing and who did not want him to do it. Hammarskjöld was 47 when he became Secretary General, the youngest in the organization's history, and by most accounts the most consequential. He was a Swedish economist and diplomat, a private man who never married, who spent his evenings reading Rilke and the medieval mystics, and who kept a diary of philosophical reflections that would be published after his death under the title Markings. In it, he wrote about sacrifice, about duty, about the cost of standing in the space between powerful men and the people they harm. He was not a politician performing conviction. He was a man living it. And the institution he led, the United Nations, barely 16 years old, he had transformed from a debating society into something that could act. He created the first UN peacekeeping forces. He intervened personally in crises from the Suez to China. He believed genuinely and without cynicism that the UN could be the instrument of a just world. That belief made him dangerous because a Secretary General who merely talks can be tolerated. A Secretary General who acts must be dealt with, and in 1961, he acted. He flew into the Congo crisis, the most dangerous entanglement of Cold War politics, colonial interests, and African independence on the planet. The newly independent Congo was fracturing. The mineral-rich province of Katanga had declared secession under Moïse Tshombe, backed by Belgian mining interests, Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, which controlled the uranium and copper that made Katanga one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on Earth. Katanga's secession was supported quietly by elements within the British, French, and American governments who preferred a compliant client state to an independent Congo that might align with Moscow. Hammarskjöld put the UN directly in the middle, peacekeeping forces on the ground, the Secretary General himself flying to negotiate. He was not a neutral observer. He was an actor, and his actions threatened some of the most powerful economic and intelligence interests in the Western world. The day after the crash, former U.S. President Harry Truman said something that has echoed for 60 years. He was on the point of getting something done when they killed him. Truman did not say when he died. He said when they killed him. And nobody asked him to clarify. The first investigation was conducted by the British-run Rhodesian authorities, the same colonial administration whose economic interests were aligned with the mining companies backing Katanga's secession. They concluded pilot error. The plane flew too low on approach. Case closed. A subsequent UN investigation was more cautious. It could not determine the cause and left the verdict open, but it relied heavily on testimony gathered by the Rhodesian inquiry, and the Rhodesian inquiry had been conducted by people with reasons to prefer a simple answer. And here is where the case should make you uncomfortable, because the evidence that was dismissed or ignored in 1961 has not gone away. It has accumulated. Local residents near the crash site told investigators they saw more than one aircraft in the sky that night. Some described a second plane, possibly a jet. Some said the DC-6 appeared to be on fire before it hit the ground. Their testimony was discounted by the colonial authorities. The witnesses were African villagers, and their accounts were treated as unreliable. I want to be careful about what I do with that, because eyewitness testimony of nighttime aerial events is genuinely difficult to assess, and I will not pretend that every witness account is equally solid. But I will also not pretend that the systematic dismissal of African witnesses by a British colonial administration in 1961 carries no bias. There is something in this case that goes beyond the mechanics of aviation. It is the question of whose voice counts, whose testimony is admitted, whose account is written into the record, and whose is written out. The villagers near Ndola saw something. They said so at the time. They were ignored not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient, and because the system that decided which evidence mattered was the same system that had reasons to want the crash explained simply and closed quickly. I cannot tell you their testimony proves the plane was attacked. I can tell you that the decision to dismiss it was not made by neutral observers. In 2015, the United Nations reopened the investigation. A panel led by Tanzanian judge Mohamed Chande Othman reviewed new evidence, declassified documents, re-examined radio intercepts, fresh witness testimony, and concluded that there was persuasive evidence that the aircraft was subjected to some form of attack or threat as it circled to land. The panel asked member states to release relevant intelligence files. Some did. Some did not. The most recent report in 2024 stated plainly that specific and crucial information related to the crash continues to be withheld by a handful of governments. I want you to hear that clearly because it is not a conspiracy theory. It is the official finding of a UN-appointed investigator reported to the General Assembly. The United Nations is asking its own member states to share what they know about the death of its own Secretary General. And some of those states' democracies, NATO allies, countries that sit on the Security Council, are refusing. 63 years after the crash with the Cold War, over with Katanga, long reabsorbed with every plausible suspect, long-dead governments are still holding documents they do not want the world to read. The question is not whether Hammarskjöld was murdered. The question is why, after 6 decades, the file is still locked, and who benefits from keeping it that way. I do not know what happened to that plane. I cannot tell you it was shot down because the evidence, while persuasive, is not conclusive. I cannot tell you it was pilot error because the investigation that reached that conclusion was conducted by people with a stake in the answer. What I can tell you is that a man who threatened the interests of multiple Western governments died in circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained, and that the governments who might hold the explanation have chosen for more than 60 years not to share it. That is not a theory. That is a fact. And it is the quietest, most polite, most bureaucratic way to bury a man twice. It would be natural to hear that and think, well, that is espionage, the Cold War. Intelligence agencies playing chess with human lives in Africa. Terrible but distant, the kind of thing that happened in a different era, under different rules, behind classified doors that may never open. So let me take you somewhere closer and more explicit and harder to explain away. A place where the state did not merely lock the file, it provided the car, the police officers, and the hands that did the work. A man was kidnapped in broad daylight on one of the most famous boulevards in Paris by French police officers acting on behalf of a foreign king with the knowledge of at least 3 intelligence agencies. And he was never seen again. A man was standing on the pavement outside Brasserie Lippe on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, one of the most visible, most public stretches of sidewalk in Paris. 2 men in plain clothes approached him. "You have a meeting with some politicians," one of them said. The man, accustomed to being followed, accustomed to the attention of police, stepped into the back of an unmarked Peugeot. The car pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic. The man inside was never seen again. His body has never been found. And the 2 men who put him in the car were not criminals, not kidnappers in the ordinary sense. They were French police officers working off duty on assignment for a foreign intelligence service. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment because it is the hinge of this entire case, and it is the reason I brought it to you. Not gangsters, not mercenaries, police, officers of the French Republic using the authority and the tradecraft of their position to abduct a man on French soil and deliver him to agents of a foreign government. That is not a failure of the state. That is the state functioning just not for the people it was supposed to protect. The man in the car was Mehdi Ben Barka, and he was one of the most significant political figures in the post-colonial world. He was Moroccan, a mathematician and teacher who had tutored the crown prince before turning to politics, rising to lead the left-wing opposition to King Hassan II, and eventually being sentenced to death in absentia after a power struggle that drove him into exile. By 1965, he was living in Geneva, organizing the Tricontinental Conference, a gathering in Havana that would unite liberation movements from Asia, Africa, and Latin America into a single front. He was a colleague of Che Guevara, a contact of Malcolm X, a man whose vision for the post-colonial world directly threatened the interests of every Western power still invested in controlling its former colonies. The king wanted him gone. He was not the only one. The trap was elegant. A French filmmaker named Georges Franju was used wittingly, or not as bait. Ben Barka was told that Franju wanted to make a documentary about decolonization and needed his participation. The meeting was set for Paris. When Ben Barka arrived at the Boulevard Saint-Germain, the 2 police officers were waiting. They put him in the car. He was driven to a villa in the Paris suburb of Fontenay-le-Vicomte. What happened inside that villa is the subject of competing accounts, none of them confirmed, all of them ugly. According to Ahmed Bukhari, a former Moroccan intelligence agent who broke his silence in 2001, Ben Barka was tortured and killed by General Mohamed Oufkir, Morocco's interior minister and head of intelligence, and his body was later returned to Morocco and dissolved in acid. Other accounts describe different methods and different burial sites. None has been confirmed. The body has never been recovered. And here is where the case opens into something larger than one man's death. Because the list of governments that were involved, not suspected, not theorized, but documented through court proceedings, declassified files, and the testimony of participants, is staggering. Muratko Ufkir planned and likely carried out the killing. He was convicted in absentia by a French court in 1967. He never returned to France to serve his sentence. He died in 1972, shot after a failed coup against the king he had served. France. The SDECE, France's External Intelligence Service, was involved at minimum in the logistics. French police officers physically carried out the abduction. When the scandal broke, President de Gaulle ordered an investigation, purged parts of his intelligence service, and broke diplomatic relations with Morocco. But the full extent of French complicity has never been established because the files were classified, and when portions were released in 2001 and 2004, Ben Barka's son, Bachir, called it a pseudo-release, insisting that the most damaging documents had been withheld. Israel. According to Ronen Bergman, Israel's foremost intelligence journalist, writing in Rise and Kill. First, based on interviews with Mossad operatives, the Israeli intelligence service helped locate Ben Barka in Geneva and assisted in luring him to Paris. The Mossad's relationship with Morocco was transactional. Israel provided intelligence training for Morocco's secret service. Morocco provided access to Arab summit meetings. Ben Barka was in this account a favor returned. The United States. The CIA acknowledged through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1976 that it possessed more than 1,800 documents related to Ben Barka. As of the most recent public accounting, those documents have not been released. I need to be straight about the weight of all this because 4 intelligence agencies from 4 democracies is a list that sounds like fiction, and I will not present it as though the case is simple. It is not simple. The degree of involvement varied. Morocco ordered and executed. France facilitated, Israel located, and the CIA's role remains behind 1,800 pages that no one outside Langley has read. I am not telling you that 4 governments conspired to murder one man. I am telling you that 4 governments had knowledge, involvement, or documentation, and that none of them has fully accounted for what it knew. The difference between conspiracy and complicity is important, and I do not have enough information to tell you which word applies to whom. But I have enough to tell you that the answer is locked in filing cabinets on 4 continents, and that 60 years of requests from courts, journalists, and Ben Barka's own son have not been enough to open them. 37 people connected to the case have died in suspicious circumstances or disappeared in the years since. Ufkir was shot. Figon, the middleman who helped lure Ben Barka to Paris, was found dead in his apartment, officially a suicide. The trail of the dead is long enough that it has its own gravity, pulling the case deeper into darkness, with every person who might have talked and did not live to. Bachir Ben Barka Mehdi's son is still fighting. He was 25 when his father disappeared, a young man whose life was bisected by a car pulling away from a curb. He has spent his entire adult life in French courts, filing motions requesting files keeping the case open against systems in 2 countries that would prefer it closed. Every time the investigation has approached something that looks like an answer, international arrest warrants, new witness testimony, declassified fragments, something intervenes. In 2007, France prepared arrest warrants for Moroccan suspects. They were never delivered. In 2009, new warrants were issued through Interpol and suspended the following day without public explanation. In 2017, France declassified 89 SDECE documents from 1965 and 1966, and Bachir called it a pseudo-release, insisting the most damaging files remained sealed. I want to say something about Bachir, because he is the person in this case who makes it more than a geopolitical puzzle. He was not a spy. He was not a politician. He was a son whose father left for a meeting and never came home. And the thing that makes his story different from any ordinary family's grief is this: everyone knows that the answer exists. It is not lost. It is not destroyed. It is sitting in filing cabinets in Paris and Rabat and Langley, and the people who hold those cabinets have decided decade after decade that his father's death is less important than whatever those files would reveal about their own governments. Bachir is not fighting against the unknown. He is fighting against the known but withheld. And that distinction is the cruelest thing about this entire case. A man stepped into a car on the most famous boulevard in Paris and vanished from the face of the earth. The police put him there. The intelligence services of 3 countries helped. And a 4th has 1,800 pages in a drawer that it will not open. That is not a cold case. That is a kept case, kept cold deliberately by the people who could warm it if they chose. Johnson here last case, and it is the most recent and in some ways the most disorienting. If these cases matter to you, and I think they do, because you're still here, subscribe and tap the bell. It's how this keeps happening. Now let me take you to Germany. In Ndola, the state locked the files. In Paris, the state provided the police officers and the car. Each time the state's hand has been more visible, more direct, more undeniable. The last case pushes into territory that is harder to map. Because in Germany, in 1991, the state is not one thing. It is 2 things becoming one with the intelligence apparatus of a collapsed dictatorship, dissolving into the security architecture of a reunified democracy. And in the fog of that transition, a man who controlled the largest transfer of wealth in modern European history was shot dead in his home. And the investigation could never determine which shadow in the fog held the rifle. A rifle round passed through a bedroom window and struck a man in the chest. One shot precise from a distance that required skill and a scope and steady hands. The man was sitting in his home in Dusseldorf with his wife Hergard beside him. He died almost instantly. The shooter firing from a garden or an allotment across the street was never seen, never identified, never found. The man was Detlev Karsten Rohwedder, and at the moment of his death he was arguably the most consequential economic figure in Europe. But before the Treuhand, before the politics, before the bullet, he was a steel man. He had spent most of his career as the CEO of Hoesch AG, one of Germany's major steel corporations, a hard industry, a hard job, a world of unions and layoffs and plant closures where the decisions you make on paper destroy real lives in real towns. He understood what privatization meant at the human level because he had done it before on a smaller scale, and he had seen what it cost. When the German government offered him the presidency of the Treuhandanstalt, the agency created to privatize the entire economy of the former East Germany, he accepted knowing that the job was probably impossible. 8,500 state-owned enterprises, factories, farms, hotels, shipyards, power plants, everything the communist state had owned, which was everything. The Treuhand's job was to sell it, restructure it, or close it. Rohwedder was the man who decided which door each enterprise walked through. He controlled in practical terms the economic future of 17 million people. And he tried this matters because the man who replaced him did not try the same way to do it with some measure of conscience. His motto reportedly was rapid privatization, decisive restructuring, careful closure. The word careful was the one that cost him enemies. East German workers hated him because privatization meant layoffs no matter how careful you were, millions of jobs lost, entire communities gutted. Western investors hated him because careful meant slow and slow meant expensive, and they wanted to buy cheap and fast. Former East German officials hated him because every factory he sold was a piece of their power base disappearing. And somewhere in the constellation of people who wanted Rohwedder gone, or who simply wanted careful gone, someone decided to make it happen. The morning after the assassination, a letter arrived claiming responsibility. It bore the symbol of the Red Army faction, the 5-pointed star over a Heckler & Koch submachine gun, and it named Rohwedder as a target of the revolutionary struggle. The RAF. The third generation. Germany's most notorious left-wing terror group, the descendants of Baader-Meinhof, still active in the early 90s, still capable of targeted killings. And here, I need to stop and tell you why the RAF claim is both the most obvious answer and the most suspicious one, because the distinction matters. The first and second generations of the RAF were brutal but transparent. You knew who they were, what they wanted, and how they operated. The third generation was different. It operated almost entirely in shadow. Its membership was never fully established. Its decision-making structure was never mapped. Its communiques arrived, but the people behind them remained faceless in a way that the founders never were. And a persistent theory among German investigators and intelligence analysts holds that by the late 1980s, the RAF label may have been used as cover by operatives who had no connection to the original movement, including possibly people with links to the East German Stasi or to Western intelligence services seeking a convenient brand for political violence. I should be very careful here because this is the point where the case slips from investigation into speculation, and I owe you the distinction. There is no proof that the Stasi orchestrated Rohwedder's assassination. There is no proof that any Western intelligence agency was involved. There is no proof that the RAF letter was a false flag. What there is, and this is what the case rests on, is a landscape of unanswered questions that the investigation was never able to resolve, set against a backdrop that made almost anything plausible. In 1991, Germany was not one country with one security apparatus. It was two countries collapsing into one, and the intelligence infrastructure of both was in chaos. The Stasi had been formally dissolved, but thousands of its former officers were still in Germany, still possessed their skills, and still had access to weapons, safe houses, and networks that had not been fully dismantled. Stasi files had been partially destroyed, partially stolen, partially archived, and the portions that survived were so vast that they would take decades to process. Meanwhile, Western intelligence agencies, the BND, the CIA MI6, were losing their Cold War informants and scrambling to reposition in a world that had changed overnight. The fog was total. And in that fog, someone with a rifle, a scope, and a clear line of sight to Detlef Rohwedder's bedroom window took a single shot and changed the course of German economic history. I want to be honest about something that makes this case different from the other two, and harder. With Hammarskjöld, you can point to specific governments withholding specific files. With Ben Barka, you can name the police officers, the intelligence agencies, the chain of responsibility. With Rohwedder, you cannot point at anything with that kind of specificity. The fog is the point. It is not that one agency covered up the murder. It is that the entire landscape of post-reunification Germany was a cover, a fog of competing services, dissolving networks, unaccountable agents, and institutional chaos so deep that a professional assassination could be carried out, claimed, and never solved, because there was simply no stable ground on which to build an investigation. The BKA, Germany's Federal Criminal Police, investigated for years and never charged anyone. The case remains officially open. The rifle was never found. The shooter was never identified. And the fog, 34 years later, has not lifted. What did change after Rohwedder's death was the Treuhand itself. His successor, Birgit Breuel, accelerated the privatization process, significantly selling faster with fewer protections for workers at lower prices. The word careful left the building with Rohwedder's body. Whether that outcome was connected to the assassination, I cannot tell you, and I will not speculate beyond noting that the question exists and that serious people have asked it. Who benefits is a reasonable question in any murder investigation, but it is not evidence, and I will not treat it as such. What I will say is that Rohwedder's death removed the one person who was trying to balance speed with conscience, and that balance did not survive him. The man who insisted on careful was killed, and what followed was not careful at all. A bullet through a window, a letter with a red star, and behind both the fog of a country being born, where the old intelligence services had not yet died, and the new ones had not yet learned to see. Somewhere in that fog someone held a rifle. The investigation could never determine who, and the fog, which should have cleared by now, has instead become permanent, not because the truth evaporated, but because too many institutions benefit from the poor visibility. A plane descending toward an African airfield that never arrived. A car pulling away from a Paris boulevard with a man who was never seen again. A bullet passing through a bedroom window in Dusseldorf from a shooter who was never found. 3 men. 3 democracies. 3 investigations that ran at full speed into the same wall, the wall that separates what governments know from what governments will admit. In each case, the evidence led not to a suspect in a jail cell, but to a door marked classified, and in each case the hand on the lock belonged to the state. We build our justice systems on the promise that the state is the seeker of truth, that when someone is killed, the full weight of the government falls on the side of the dead. These 3 cases say that when the dead are killed for political reasons, and the politics touch the interests of the state itself, the weight shifts, not always visibly, not always dramatically, sometimes just a file reclassified, a warrant suspended, a witness account dismissed, a search delayed by a few critical hours. The machinery of the state does not need to conspire. It only needs to slow down, and time, as I have told you before, does the rest. Dag Hammarskjöld, Mehdi Ben Barka, Detlev Rohwedder, 3 men who stood at the intersection of power and change, and who were removed from it. I cannot tell you who killed them, not with the certainty that justice requires, but I can tell you who has the answers, and I can tell you that they have chosen not to share them. That choice repeated across 6 decades, 3 continents, and more filing cabinets than any journalist or judge has ever been allowed to open, is its own kind of verdict, not on the killers, on the systems that protect them. I'm Johnson. Thank you for sitting with the hard ones. I'll see you on the next.